I'm here to talk about getting from the economy we have to the one that we need. And the first thing I want to start with is a very macro question, which is what is the basic function an economy should perform? Is it to distribute resources and generate wealth? We can probably all agree with that. But is it to fairly distribute wealth, resources, and access to opportunities? So adding in the element of values. Or is it to fairly distribute resources, wealth, and access to opportunities to enable human civilization to flourish? I imagine that the second two have somewhat resonated with this crowd, but also that many of you would agree that they are not really reflected in the global economy that we see today. I work in the responsible and sustainable investment field, and in this field we are intimately concerned with the relationship between capital markets and a physical and social reality and the basic functioning of the economy. And some investors are involved in this industry because looking at environmental and social factors gives a truer picture of a company or a business's true risk-reward profile, and it's accretive to returns over the long term. And some investors are concerned because they really want to intentionally allocate capital to the environmental and social solutions to the various crises that we see in the world today. And some investors actually, frankly, want a little bit of both. And what we do as professionals is we pore over the spreadsheets and try and figure out a better way of doing things. But I feel that the pressure that is on the investment industry to be a part of the solution or to even be at the vanguard of solving some of our environmental and social problems is because of three tragedies that we see in the global economy. I'm going to speak about these three tragedies a little bit and draw from my personal experience to illustrate, and then offer a bit of a framework that perhaps we can take back into our contexts for addressing those tragedies and for moving to the economy that we need. So the first tragedy is the tragedy of the commons. This is a term that was coined by an English economist in the early 1800s, and it was to describe the phenomenon that individuals acting in their economically rational self-interest would have very little interest in preserving the value of common goods for the benefit of all. And in the modern world, that this has been associated with the ecological movement. In the language of my industry, the tragedy of the commons is often called externalities. So the idea that private businesses operating in profit-driven models really have very little incentive to look at environmental and social issues as relevant to the business unless they can be appropriately priced in at the front end. I lived in China in the few years after the Beijing Olympics, and this period of time was very notable because of the emergence of the phenomenon of the airpocalypse. So after a couple of decades of economic liberalization, the country's efforts to rapidly move millions of people from poverty into urbanized centers supported by coal-based power, and also to onshore the world's heavy industries, had resulted in air that was so toxic that we all needed to have air purifiers in the home in order for our internal air to be safe. We also were watching the air quality indicators on a daily basis. And it really is the illustration of what happens at the very extreme end of not taking care of public goods for the well-being of all. And the legacy of that period is that half of the Chinese people I know have respiratory issues or relatives with lung cancer. And the air quality problem has become so severe that it's actually an inhibitor to economic growth, and it's a political risk. And I think that we can probably think of other areas where we see tragedy of the commons type problems. So I can think of the opioid crisis in the pharmaceutical industry, or the misinformation, disinformation problems around social media, etc. One of the things that we really struggle with is that it's very difficult to accurately put together the accurate price signals for some of these issues so that before the externalities become a problem. The second tragedy is the tragedy of the horizon. So this is a more recently coined term by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. And Carney was using this term to highlight that short-termism in private business and in capital markets is a problem because if we're not able to take into account long-range issues like climate change, this will be to the detriment of the future well-being of future generations. And so the tragedy of the horizon is that the prices of goods and services today on which we are making our investment decisions do not or cannot reflect the dislocation to markets and economies that will be caused by climate change. I've experienced this a little bit. I want to refer to an experience I had in East Timor, living there in the years after the UN-led reconstruction of the country. And at that time, East Timor was the world's newest nation. It was also Asia's poorest nation. And the biggest nation-building debate at that time was, how was East Timor, a tiny country of which a third of the population had been massacred, how were they going to generate a sustainable source of economic growth or economic wealth that would knit them to the global economy? There is a very lucrative oil field off the shore of East Timor called the Greater Sunrise Oil Field. And East Timor doesn't have or didn't have the kind of infrastructure and the skills to be able to monetize that oil field. So they entered into a multi-year fight with Australia about the royalties to the oil field and how the asset was going to be developed. And the latest is that by around 2030, this oil field will become its most profitable, its most productive. I think the tragedy there is twofold for the Timorese people, because the oil field will be productive exactly at the time when oil will be peaking, according to the International Energy Association. As well as that, the exploitation and extraction of the resources from the oil field will actually potentially accelerate and contribute to the climate change issues that are experienced by future generations of Southeast Asians. The final tragedy I want to speak to is the tragedy of participation. And this is a term that I have coined to illustrate that global wealth has become increasingly concentrated in small global elites, and that trickle-down economics has not been effective at performing that basic function of distribution fairly. If anyone has spent time with Indigenous communities almost anywhere in the world, you will have experienced the tragedy of participation. And in my experience, this was in remote Australia with Aboriginal communities, where the GDP numbers of Australia as an OECD country hide the fact that there is abject poverty happening in our country. And one of the challenges of these remote communities, and because of the complexities of supply chains, a bottle of Coke will be cheaper than a bottle of fruit juice. And tinned spaghetti and a bag of chips will be cheaper than a fresh apple. And so there is inability of communities to access nourishing calories in the face of welfare dependency. So the tragedy of participation, it really requires us to ask some serious questions about how we distribute resources. So we're very good at diagnosing the problems. Like, we can diagnose these symptoms of the illness that we have, but the challenge really is, how do we solve it? And there still continues today to be a lot of finger pointing that governments need to do this and companies need to do that and investors should be doing this, and well, it's really the public not voting in the right elected representatives, etc. But I think if we agree that the economy has manifestly failed to serve the interests of all peoples, we are all in this together and we are all bear some responsibility to change that system. I think that if we are able to rise out of the learnings of these problems that we've had, and we're able to think at the level of principle about how does the economy construct human relations, that might be a start for us. So I'm going to take us on a very quick whistle-stop tour across how human beings have been framed or constituted by different economic systems as a way of illuminating how this might be possible. Think about feudalism. So feudalism really constructed human beings as being in a hierarchy where you've got a small number of landowning aristocrats who are protected by and served by the masses. And there's nothing really unjust about this system because it's the natural order of things. We would look at it with today's values and say that's really unjust. But that was the constitution of how human beings were at that time. If we think about socialism, we have human beings as productive workers who are in a constant struggle for domination or for power with those who control the capital. And if we think about materialist capitalism, which is our current system, human beings are also framed and constituted a certain way. Acquisitive, endlessly acquisitive, short-term in focus and with no regard to the long term or to communal benefits, and also embroiled in a constant culture of contest and competition. And the commentator Michael Karlberg describes this very elegantly when he says that competition has become the preeminent value of a deeply materialistic age. By defining human beings as self-interested and competitive creatures, the current system structures human relations accordingly. I think it's really important to understand that this is a framing, and that if we work to change the framing of a human being, what is the worth of a human being, what is the nobility of a human being, that could unleash a cultural force to move capitalism to the place where we need it to be. Reflecting on the philosophy of different economic systems opens that up as a possibility. However, when we today are out there trying to design interventions, trying to come up with solutions, they're still often in the paradigm of a human being as a essentially selfish, self-motivated individual that isn't going to do anything without incentives and rewards and penalties. And so we focus on incentives and penalties, we focus on cost curves, we focus on hockey stick growth models, we focus on putting elements into the net present value calculation. And I'm not saying these aren't worthy endeavors. They are. It's what my colleagues and I spend a lot of our time doing. But after spending quite a number of years working at this level, I've come to the view that this is essentially a tactical level to be working at. And tactics are defined by our systems. It's principles that define system change. So I want to encourage us to lift up into the level of principle, to reframe who we are as human beings, and to see what force that could unleash in the global economy. I'm inspired by the writings of the Baha'i Faith, which frame the human being very differently to these other economic systems. The writings say, we cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us, and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions. This is a very different conception of a human being from the one that we see promoted by capitalism today. This is a conception of a human being as in relationship with other people and with the environment, in an interconnected network of constant actions and reactions. This is also the conception of us as actors with agency in the world, and that if we marry together our tactics with our principles, we might be able to foster a more productive culture, one that sustains human life and human civilization. I'm encouraged by the work of some recent commentators, including the anthropologist economist Jason Hickel, who has also started to theorize that the struggle before us is more than just a struggle over economics. It is a struggle over our very theory of being. Who are we as human beings? And he has put forward a theory that if we were to collapse the boundaries between human beings and nature, that this would potentially be a more systemic response to the climate crisis. I believe that we need to be promoting an ethic of care in our businesses and in our economies as an alternative to an ethic of constant individualistic competition. And I think that we see early bellwethers of that starting to come about. So we have evidence, and this is where I get to geek out as an responsible investment analyst, we see evidence that companies that focus on culture and well-being of their employees, an increase in the well-being of employees at companies is predictive of better financial outcomes. We also see that companies working in heavy industries, such as transportation and industrial goods, have higher profitability the more renewable energy they use. That seems like a no-brainer. And we also see that executive teams with greater diversity among them, whether it's women or people of different ethnic backgrounds, the companies in the top quartile of performance on diversity generally outperform the companies in the bottom quartile in general as a whole. Tends to correlate with better performance. So here are some early signs that companies that are using an ethic of care and looking across their entire stakeholder base to make sure that benefits are spread throughout that stakeholder base may be eventually, over the long term, rewarded for that. And these are just a few metrics I could have picked. There's dozens of other studies and papers out there starting to build this business case. We also have more data and tools than we've ever had before to be able to redesign incentives, change our measures of success, and also report transparently to the markets about what those metrics are. So, for example, if we look at the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies in the US, we've seen an avalanche of ESG or sustainability disclosure from this group, and it's now overwhelmingly the case, and it's voluntary disclosure for the most part. 96% of companies in 2022, this data is a little bit out of date, now disclosing, and 81% of the Russell 1000, which is another very important investment index. We are also seeing more than half of these S&P companies incorporate some form of ESG metric into their executive compensation. That is a game change over the last few years as well. And a lot of those metrics are tied to human beings, human capital, employee-related metrics. So this is a sign of hope as well. And then finally, I think we're starting to see the culture change. We're seeing expectations put on CEOs to be more vocal and more present on moral and ethical debates of the day, to be more responsive. We're starting to see the boundaries between the financial decisions that companies make and the environmental and social impacts that they cause collapse, and people are more and more demanding of more accountability, and that's a massive cultural shift. Just this morning, I was reading an article put out by a couple of researchers about the quiet climate quitting that's happening among oil and gas majors, among their younger employees who are seeing more and more dissonance between the goals of the company and the climate crisis. So these cultural pressures are mounting, and I think that that's also a sign of that we're seeing more of the emergence of an ethic of care, an ethic of caring for stakeholders in the economy. So I'd like to propose a challenge to us today, 3 questions that we can reflect on to understand how we can, in our own context, start to adopt this ethic of care. So the first question is, what needs in the real economy does my organization's purpose solve for, and for whom? So this anchors us in a social and an environmental reality. It anchors us in the real economy. It gives us a question that enables us to think about, well, who are the stakeholders that are benefiting, and who's being impacted, and how are those impacts being mitigated? It also potentially opens up a way for leaders and employees to really deeply connect with the work that they do day to day. The second challenge is, how would you explain and justify this purpose to future generations? So this anchors you in a moment of time, but also puts you in relationship with an imagined future, with imagined grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And how would you explain what your organization does to them in language they can understand, and would you be able to explain it in a way that helps them to see that the wealth generated from the activity was actually inherited by them, or they were included in that wealth generation? And the final question is, whose voices inform our purpose? So it probably goes without saying that if we want to have a more inclusive economy, we're going to need to have more inclusion and diversity around the table in order to be able to define an organizational purpose that is truly inclusive. In my little corner of the world, I'm starting to see this, and it's actually been noticed by commentators that among responsible and sustainable investment professionals, there's more women in leadership roles shaping that agenda than is the norm in the rest of the finance industry. And is that just coincidence? Is that just the zeitgeist? I think that it's actually quite likely that people who've traditionally been outsiders from an industry are actually very well positioned to go into roles where thinking differently is rewarded. And so from that perspective, diversifying our teams and our leadership at organizations is not only a matter of checking diversity boxes, it's actually also a matter of existential survival. So I offer this framework as a way of trying to give us something practical we can do that elevates our thinking from the tactical to the principled. And if we're able to generate a greater dialogue between our tactics and our principles, perhaps then we'll be able to start moving towards the economy that we really need and deserve. Thank you.
Think of sharing what you know.